The Great Basin, a sea of silence, a desert wilderness, a sacred shrine encased in a protective wall of mountains. To survive in this arid abyss was an accomplishment in itself, and yet, for 4,000 years, the Paiutes not only survived in this foreboding terrain, but cultivated a rich culture. For the Paiutes, the Great Basin was not a place of exile and desolation. It was home. Home, a land of delicious piñon nuts, a food of celebration and memories. Home, a terrain of sagebrush, an aromatic herb with the perfect bark for skirts and baskets. Home, a world where antelopes were charmed, not hunted, where decisions were made through persuasion, not corrosion, where hair, no matter how beautiful, was cut off to mourn the death of a loved one. The Paiutes were no ordinary people, in no ordinary land, and in the year 1844, they gave rise to no ordinary woman. Her name was Sarah Winnemucca.
When Winnemucca was 4 years old, the whites poisoned the Humboldt River with disease, killing many in her tribe, including 2 of her aunts and a number of her cousins. An estimated half of the entire Paiute population died from disease and warfare between 1859 and 1865, and the list of injustices only grew. Winnemucca witnessed settlers heedlessly hunt the antelopes the Paiutes once charmed. Ranchers and farmers cut down the piñons from which savory piñon nuts grew. Livestock consume and trample upon the grasses whose seeds the Paiutes relied on for food. The Paiutes had their livelihoods stolen from them, just so that they could be herded onto the Pyramid Lake Reservation, given insufficient food and clothing, and told the land they had lived upon for millennia was not their own.
Winnemucca knew she had to stand up for her people. In the spring of 1870, she wrote a letter to Major Henry Douglas, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Nevada, in which she criticized the Pyramid Lake Reservation agents and called for a guaranteed permanent home for Native Americans on their native soil. The letter created shockwaves. Major Douglas sent the letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. Large bands of Paiutes were relocated to Camp McDermott. The Army promised not to force them onto reservations and to provide rations. This arrangement will ultimately save their life, protecting them from the disaster ahead, the Bannock War.
There are many lines of thought for how the Bannock War began. General Howard claimed the violence began when the army prevented Bannock chief Buffalo Horn from murdering 3 Nez Perce Indians. General Crook blamed starvation brought on by inadequate rations at the Fort Hall Reservation and by ecological imperialism. Winnemucca, however, asserted that the rape of a young Bannock girl precipitated the war.
Regardless of the cause, the fighting that broke out in the spring of 1878 was never the Paiutes' battle. But Winnemucca knew that some of the Paiutes had taken residence at the Bannock camp and feared they'd be caught and killed in the crossfire. She refused to sit back and allow her people to be slaughtered. She was determined to take a stand. Winnemucca devised a plan to dispatch herself from Sheep Ranch, an army rendezvous point, track down the Bannock camp, and promise her people protection and rations it would allow her to rescue and transfer them to the army.
The army doubted the likelihood of her success, but nonetheless, desperate, and perhaps heedless for her life, allowed her to pursue her plan. On the way, she learned from her brother Lee that the Bannocks had taken their father and his band prisoner and confiscated their possessions. Winnemucca grew more determined than ever. She disguised herself as a Bannock woman, and Lee led her to the camp.
When Winnemucca arrived, her people rejoiced. She helped them sneak off into the night. They were pursued but reached the safety of the sheep ranch on June 15. Winnemucca had traveled 220 miles on horseback over the course of 3 days, a seemingly impossible feat. According to General Oliver O. Howard, a Union soldier and the founder of Howard University, Winnemucca had rescued 75 of her people. For the remainder of the war, she served as a scout, an interpreter, a guide, and an advisor.
However, the Paiutes' troubles were far from over. In September, they received an order that all Indians at Camp McDermott were to be transferred to Camp Harney. From there, things only got worse. Around Christmas time, Captain Cochran delivered heartbreaking news. All the Paiutes at Camp Harney were to be transferred to the Yakima Reservation, beyond the Columbia River.
Winnemucca was distraught. She'd risked her life to save her people in the Bannock War. She'd promised them safety and security in exchange for peace. She had served as the white man's mouthpiece, delivering the white man's lies, believing, perhaps hoping they were truths. With a mere week to prepare, Winnemucca warned as many to escape as she could, an act of bravery that to this day is honored by the descendants of those she saved. And yet, there were many more whom she could not save. But dutifully, she accompanied them on a 350-mile trek in the midst of winter across unforgiving snow-covered mountains. Women and children were dragged by soldiers into wagons. Men walked in shackles. After a journey that greatly resembled the Trail of Tears, the Paiutes arrived at the Yakima Reservation on February 2, 1879.
Life on the Yakima Reservation was a nightmare. Agent Wilbur, who was in charge of the reservation, was a Methodist Episcopalian who believed that it was his God-given destiny to witness the gradual progress of the people committed to my charge from a state of degraded barbarism to comparative civilization, from the gross blackness of heathen corruption to the glorious light and liberty of the gospel of the Son of God. With this frame of mind, Agent Wilbur went about ensuring that each and every Native American on his reservation went without sufficient food and clothes. But evil agent aside, the worst part of Yakima was the exile. As the reservation physician wrote, "I never saw any people, at any time, so desperately homesick. I thought of the Israelites when they were captive in Babylon. Things could not continue this way." And so, in November 1879, Winnemucca once again took a stand.
She began lecturing in San Francisco, and by January of 1880, she decided to take her message to Washington, D.C. While there, she met with Secretary of Interior Carl Schurz and spoke briefly to President Rutherford B. Hayes. Her efforts seemed to produce results. Secretary Schurz issued an order stating the Paiutes were allowed to leave Yakima to return to their local Malheur reservation.
However, when Winnemucca returned to Yakima, Agent Wilbur denied having received the order. She gave him a letter from Washington as proof, but Wilbur still refused to let her people leave.
Winnemucca was disheartened, but nonetheless carried on, lecturing and writing. How could she not? 510 Paiutes arrived at Yakima in 1879. Within 2 years, that number had plummeted to 440. Times were desperate. While staying at nearby Fort Vancouver, Sarah communicated with her people through her brother Lee and organized a strike, a movement of passive resistance that paralleled the arguments of Thoreau and the movements of Gandhi and King. The Paiutes stopped taking land, stopped farming, stopped building houses. Any action that could be perceived as acceptance of their situation at Yakima, they altogether ceased. The strike worked, and Wilbur resigned. By the end of 1884, no more Paiutes remained at Yakima. It was a time to rejoice.
But it was also a time to mourn. Out of the 510 Paiutes that came to Yakima, only 264 had survived to return home. Winnemucca, motivated by this small victory, continued her work in earnest. She traveled to Boston in 1883, where she sojourned with two elderly sisters, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody and Mary Mann, widow of the celebrated educator Horace Mann. While in Boston, Sarah endeavored to put her experiences on paper. In 1883, she published Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims, a 268-page combination of an autobiography, a history of the Paiutes, and a call for change. It was the first book written in English by an Indian woman.
When Winnemucca returned home, she was determined to open a school. In May of 1885, her brother Natchez purchased a 160-acre ranch, about 2 miles south of the town of Lovelock. Natchez was more than happy to allow his sister to start her school on his ranch. With great zeal, Winnemucca built several traditional Paiute brush shelters and opened the school in July. It was an instant success.
To understand the greatness of Winnemucca's school, one must fully comprehend its alternative. The U.S. policy at the time aimed to eradicate tribal culture and civilize Native Americans. Assimilation through education was performed at boarding schools far from tribal influence. Unsurprisingly, few families signed up for such a nightmare. So, to increase enrollment, government agents scoured Nevada, snatching children from their mother's arms, threatening jail time for non-compliance. Such methods were as ineffective as they were cruel, but Winnemucca did things quite differently. Winnemucca knew literacy and fluency in English were necessary to face the changing world on fair footing. She believed in selective adoption of the white man's innovations, but Winnemucca was no assimilationist. Winnemucca profoundly valued Paiute culture. She believed that Paiutes were morally superior to whites. Unlike whites, Paiutes had no curse words, no whiskey. They were not driven by insatiable greed. With this mindset, Winnemucca centered the school around the notion that the Paiutes should learn of the white man's ways, not live by them.
Within a year, Winnemucca School boasted 24 students. By late January 1887, she reported an enrollment of 45. The parents of 400 children applied for a spot in Sarah's school in the spring of 1887.
She started the school and worked to educate the children. I think that was the best thing that she could have done, was start the school. Or she never stopped working and speaking for the Native Americans until she was gone. I just don't know of any other woman that went out and did what she did for the Paiute people.
Winnemucca did not live in a time of greatness. She lived in a time of great hardship for her people and for Native Americans throughout the country. The greater the opposition, the harder it is to take a stand. But Winnemucca would not be defeated. She never gave up when the white man said no. She never backed down. She never accepted her people's suffering with silent submission. Each time Winnemucca hit a roadblock, she never despaired because she knew that with perseverance, she could always find a new path.